The year was 1965, and in the gritty, shadowy corners of Chicago, one name carried weight like few others: Tony "the Boss" DiMarco. At 42, Tony had become a fixture in the city's underworld, known for his ruthless efficiency, sharp mind, and an ironclad grip on the Mafia's operations. His influence stretched across the city's neighborhoods, from the north side to the south, where his syndicate ran everything from gambling rings to illegal liquor distribution. He was a man who knew how to make enemies disappear without leaving a trace, but he also knew when to make deals, when to stay out of sight, and when to strike with lethal precision. Tony's most prized possession, however, wasn't his extensive criminal empire or the money that came with it. It was his 1964 Cadillac Fleetwood, glossy black with polished chrome accents. It wasn't just a car, it was a symbol of his power, wealth, and the life he had worked so hard to build. The Cadillac was his statement on the streets, a luxury vehicle that made him stand out in a crowd of ordinary men. It wasn't just his mode of transportation, it was his throne on wheels. A man like Tony, who had fought and clawed his way to the top, deserved nothing less. But on a cool autumn day in 1965, Tony DiMarco disappeared. It wasn't the kind of disappearance that would send the city into an immediate panic. For those who knew the world he moved in, it wasn't uncommon for someone to vanish for a while, especially a man like Tony. A few weeks went by, no calls, no contact. His associates, though nervous, weren't immediately worried. Tony had done this before, gone off the grid for short periods, often to take care of business that was better left unsaid. But weeks stretched into months, and still no word. Tony's closest associates, men who trusted him with everything, began to ask questions. His family, too, was baffled. His wife, Rita, who had been married to him for 10 years, refused to believe the worst. They had a life together, plans, dreams, and a young son. Tony wouldn't just leave them, she insisted. His sudden absence felt wrong, like something had happened to him, but the longer Tony stayed missing, the more his associates grew uneasy. Was he in hiding? Had something gone terribly wrong? Months passed. The Chicago police, while not eager to investigate a mafia-related case too deeply, finally filed a missing persons report, but no trace of Tony was ever found. His Cadillac? Gone. His mansion in the upscale part of the city, still locked up tight, untouched. The investigation turned cold. Whispers in the underworld suggested that Tony had been betrayed, perhaps by one of his own men, and that someone had gotten to him. But nothing was ever confirmed. Theories and rumors spread like wildfire. Some said he had fled the city to avoid a crackdown from rival gangs. Others thought he had been buried in a shallow grave somewhere on the outskirts of town. The mystery of Tony DiMarco became just another dark corner in the complicated world of organized crime. His name, once feared and respected, began to fade from the headlines. By 1968, the case was closed. Tony DiMarco, presumed dead, had become a forgotten ghost in the history of Chicago's criminal past. The city moved on, as it always did, and the mystery of Tony's disappearance was relegated to whispered conversations at late-night bars and shadowy meetings in the back rooms of mob-owned businesses. But then, in 2025, exactly 60 years after Tony's disappearance, a group of construction workers were clearing out a dilapidated warehouse on the south side of Chicago, a building once used for storing supplies and equipment for various businesses across the city. The warehouse had stood empty for years, abandoned when the businesses operating out of it had gone under. The workers, as part of a new development project, were tasked with cleaning out the old building in preparation for demolition. As they cleared debris and rusted machinery, one of the workers hit something solid beneath the floorboards. At first, they thought it might be an old storage trunk or perhaps a forgotten piece of machinery. But as they dug deeper, what they uncovered was something far more startling. A buried car, its shiny black exterior still partially intact despite the years of neglect. They thought it was an old wreck at first, but as they uncovered more of the vehicle, it became clear that this wasn't just any car. This was a Cadillac, unmistakably a 1964 Fleetwood, the same model Tony DiMarco had been known to drive. The workers, unsure of what they had found, contacted the authorities. Within hours, investigators arrived on the scene, their interest piqued by the sight of the buried car. It wasn't long before the license plate and then the vehicle identification number, VIN, confirmed what they had hoped. This was Tony DiMarco's Cadillac. The discovery sent shockwaves through the city, and not just because of the long-lost car. For years, the mystery of Tony's disappearance had lingered in the air, an unsolved puzzle that had become part of the folklore of Chicago's criminal history. Tony had vanished without a trace, and now, 60 years later, the key to the mystery had emerged from the earth. but there was still no sign of Tony. The car, buried deep beneath the warehouse floor, was untouched by time, preserved in a way that suggested someone had gone to great lengths to hide it. Why had Tony's Cadillac been buried? And, more importantly, what had happened to him all those years ago? Had he been murdered and his car hidden to prevent the truth from coming to light? Or had he vanished by choice, deciding to disappear and start a new life? The mystery of Tony DiMarco's disappearance, once thought to be a case that would never be solved, was now back in the spotlight. The buried car was more than just a clue. It was a message. Someone had gone to great lengths to make sure Tony's fate remained hidden, and now, 60 years later, the world was about to learn the truth. The discovery of Tony DiMarco's Cadillac stirred the long-dormant memories of a city that had grown used to its secrets. The car, buried so carefully in the warehouse floor, seemed like the key to unlocking the mystery that had been a part of Chicago's criminal lore for decades. The investigators who arrived at the scene quickly realized that this was no ordinary find. It wasn't just the car that was important. It was the story it told. As they began to examine the vehicle, they found something that made the case even more chilling. The car wasn't damaged. The paint, although faded, was in remarkable condition. The chrome, though worn with age, still gleamed faintly under the grime. It wasn't just buried. It was carefully placed, as if someone had decided that Tony's car should be preserved, hidden, and left untouched for years. But why? Why had someone gone to such lengths to bury it deep in the earth, in a forgotten warehouse, far from the streets Tony had once ruled? The detectives dug into the car's history, quickly confirming the VIN and license plate matched the records for Tony DiMarco's Cadillac. It was his. There was no question about it. But Tony's body was nowhere to be found. The car had been buried in the exact spot where no one would think to look. It wasn't like any normal crime scene. This was a carefully orchestrated effort to hide a man, to bury his legacy as if erasing him from history. The more they investigated, the more questions arose. How did the Cadillac end up here? Was this part of a cover-up? Or was it possible that Tony had gone into hiding willingly, deciding to disappear from his criminal empire for reasons unknown? The authorities began to track the warehouse's ownership and history, hoping that the building could offer clues. What they found was startling. The warehouse had once been a front for some of Tony's closest allies in the criminal world. It had been part of a legitimate business venture, but it had served as a secondary location for illegal dealings, a place where Tony's operations had once flourished. This made sense. If the warehouse had ties to Tony's operations, then it was possible that the car had been hidden there as part of a larger scheme to cover his disappearance. But who was behind it? And why had it been done so secretly, so meticulously? For years, the authorities had searched for Tony, but no one had ever connected him to this building. It was as if the truth had been buried along with the car, locked away in the walls of this forgotten warehouse. The investigation turned its focus back to the people closest to Tony, the ones who had known him best. His wife, Rita, who had long since moved on with her life, was contacted. She had always believed that Tony's disappearance was the result of some kind of power struggle in the mob, but she'd never truly accepted that he was dead. There was always a part of her that thought Tony had gone into hiding, perhaps because the pressure of the criminal life had finally caught up to him. As detectives spoke to Rita, she revealed something new, something that had never come up in the previous investigation. Tony had been increasingly paranoid in the months before his disappearance. She recalled late-night conversations where Tony would talk about his worries, about betrayal, about losing control of his empire. She mentioned a few names, people Tony had been suspicious of, individuals within his organization whom he feared might be plotting against him. But it wasn't just fear of rivals that haunted Tony. It was also the sense that his own empire was starting to crumble. He'd been grappling with mounting pressure from law enforcement, from within his own ranks, and from outside forces trying to take over his territory. Rita also mentioned something else, something that caught the investigators off guard. Just days before he disappeared, Tony had told her he needed to go away for a while to lay low. He had hinted that he might have to disappear, that his enemies were closing in. The detectives found this piece of information critical. It suggested that Tony's disappearance wasn't a random act, but a decision he had made himself, perhaps after realizing that the people he had trusted most were turning on him. The next step was to revisit the people who had been closest to Tony's criminal operations, his associates, his underlings. These men were wary, knowing that their own pasts were tangled in the mess Tony had left behind. They were reluctant to talk, but as the investigators pressed them, they started to uncover more pieces of Tony's life. The story of Tony's disappearance wasn't just about a man being erased, it was about a shifting power struggle. Some of Tony's men, including those who had once been his most loyal soldiers, had grown resentful. They had begun to see him as weak, someone who could no longer control the growing network of crime in Chicago. Some of Tony's men admitted that in the weeks leading up to his disappearance, there had been whispers about taking over his operation. It was becoming increasingly clear that someone within his inner circle may have orchestrated his disappearance to seize control of his empire. There was a theory forming. Tony had been made to disappear, and those who took over had buried his car as a symbolic gesture to remove any trace of him from the criminal world. As the investigation progressed, the authorities found themselves facing a complex web of deceit. The syndicate that had been tied to Tony's disappearance was larger than anyone had realized, and its tendrils reached deep into Chicago's underworld. The detectives now had to confront the uncomfortable truth. Tony's disappearance wasn't just a result of mob violence. It was part of a much more calculated, well-orchestrated move by those who sought to erase him from history and take his place. Tony DiMarco had been a powerful man, a force to be reckoned with, but in the end, he was a man who had been discarded by his own people. As the investigation continued to unfold, the detectives began to piece together a chilling picture of what had happened to Tony DiMarco. The discovery of his Cadillac was no longer just a key to unraveling a missing persons case. It was the final piece to understanding the betrayal and violence that had plagued his life and led to his disappearance. The more the authorities dug into Tony's past, the clearer it became that the man who once ruled Chicago's criminal underworld had fallen victim to the very people he had trusted the most. One name continued to surface in the investigation, a name that had been mentioned in whispers but never fully investigated before. Vito the Viper Greco. Vito, a longtime associate of Tony's, had always kept a low profile, preferring to operate from the shadows. But as the detectives revisited Tony's associates, they realized that Vito had been one of the last people to see Tony before his disappearance. He had been present during several meetings in the days leading up to Tony's vanishing, and his relationship with Tony had become increasingly strained in the months before Tony went missing. Rita, Tony's wife, had mentioned that Tony had been particularly paranoid about Vito, believing that he was plotting against him. She recalled a conversation where Tony had confided that Vito was trying to take control of Tony's operations in the city. It seemed that Tony had been aware of the brewing power struggle within his organization, and Vito was emerging as the key player in that battle. As the detectives dug deeper into Vito's life, they discovered that he had quietly expanded his influence in Tony's absence. He had established his own network of loyal men, some of whom had once been Tony's most trusted lieutenants. These men had begun to operate independently, and it seemed they were positioning themselves to take over the empire Tony had built. Vito had made sure that when the time came, he would be the one left standing, the one who controlled Chicago's criminal operations. It was clear now that Tony's disappearance had not been a simple case of him fleeing to avoid law enforcement or an enemy faction. It had been the result of a calculated coup. Vito, with the help of several key players within the organization, had orchestrated Tony's removal. And once he was gone, Vito made sure that every trace of Tony's reign was erased, starting with his prized Cadillac. The buried car was more than just a symbol. It was the final act of control. Tony's car, his most personal possession, had been hidden deep beneath the warehouse floor, away from prying eyes, as if to make sure that Tony's legacy would never be found. It wasn't just about getting rid of Tony, it was about making sure no one would ever know what had truly happened to him. The detectives continued to search for Vito, but he was elusive, a ghost slipping through the cracks of the city's underworld. It became evident that Vito had prepared for this moment. He had covered his tracks carefully, leaving behind no direct evidence to tie him to Tony's disappearance. But as they pieced together the timeline of events, the detectives began to understand just how meticulously Vito had planned the entire operation. Tony had been a powerful figure, but his weakness had been his trust in those closest to him. Vito had played the long game, patiently waiting for the right moment to strike. And when Tony had started to show signs of weakness, it had been the perfect opportunity to move in. Tony's own paranoia had become his downfall, and Vito had used it to his advantage. With each passing day, the investigation took on greater urgency. The discovery of Tony's Cadillac was a revelation, but it only led to more questions. The syndicate that had once operated under Tony's control was now being exposed, one piece at a time. The ripple effect of his disappearance was far-reaching, touching not just the criminals in Chicago but law enforcement, politicians, and businessmen who had been complicit in the underworld dealings that Tony had overseen. As the authorities closed in on Vito, they began to realize the full extent of the conspiracy. Vito had not only eliminated Tony, but he had also taken steps to ensure that Tony's disappearance would be seen as an unsolved mystery, a crime that would never be solved. The buried Cadillac, Tony's most prized possession, was the final marker of a man erased from history. And yet, despite Vito's efforts to bury the past, the truth was coming to light. Tony's disappearance, once thought to be an uncrackable case, was now unraveling before the eyes of the city. As the investigation reached its climax, the authorities were finally ready to confront the man responsible for one of the most audacious betrayals in Chicago's criminal history. Vito the Viper Greco, the man who had orchestrated Tony DiMarco's fall, was about to face the consequences of his actions. But even as the detectives closed in on him, they couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story than they had uncovered. The buried Cadillac was just the tip of the iceberg. What lay beneath it was a world of deceit, corruption, and murder, one that still had its claws deeply embedded in the city's criminal underbelly. And as Vito's grip on the empire weakened, one thing was clear. The game was far from over. As the investigation zeroed in on Vito the Viper Greco, the once elusive and shadowy figure of Chicago's underworld, the detectives uncovered a chilling truth. The fall of Tony DiMarco was just one chapter in a much bigger, bloodier saga. Vito, now the central figure in this unfolding story, had orchestrated more than just the disappearance of his old boss. He had engineered a takeover, a power grab that reached far beyond Tony's Cadillac and the buried secrets of that long-forgotten warehouse. Vito's rise to power had been a careful and calculated one. For years, he had patiently cultivated relationships within the syndicate, building alliances with rival factions and securing his position at the heart of Chicago's criminal empire. But Vito had known all along that to become the boss, he had to remove the obstacle standing in his way: Tony DiMarco. It was a risk, a move that required precision and subtlety, but Vito had made sure to cover his tracks every step of the way. As the detectives dug deeper into Vito's operations, they realized that he had not only orchestrated Tony's disappearance, but had also gone to great lengths to keep it buried, literally. The buried Cadillac, Tony's most personal possession, had been a final message, a testament to Vito's control over the situation. It wasn't just about erasing Tony, it was about sending a warning to anyone who might dare challenge his authority. A message that said, "If you cross me, you'll disappear just like Tony, and no one will ever find you." The detectives learned that Vito had been carefully positioning himself for this moment, biding his time until the right opportunity presented itself. He had been watching Tony, waiting for his weakness to show. And when Tony's paranoia began to consume him, when his fear of betrayal reached its peak, Vito knew it was time to act. He made his move with cold, calculated precision. The operation had been planned for months, and when it was executed, it was flawless. Vito had made sure that Tony's loyalists would be eliminated or co-opted, ensuring no one would stand in his way once Tony was gone. The investigators were left to piece together the aftermath of Tony's removal. They discovered that Vito's control over the city's criminal enterprises had grown stronger in the months following Tony's disappearance. No one questioned his rise to power. He had already established himself as the man to trust, the man with connections that could make or break anyone in Chicago's underworld. Vito had surrounded himself with loyal men who had sworn their allegiance to him in exchange for power and protection. But as the detectives closed in on Vito, they also uncovered something more disturbing. Tony's disappearance wasn't just about power, it was about control, manipulation, and a carefully constructed web of lies. Vito had used his influence over the city's criminal world to manipulate law enforcement, to silence those who might speak out against him. He had made sure that Tony's disappearance would remain a mystery, one that would never be solved. And for years it had worked. Vito had remained untouchable. But now, 60 years after Tony's disappearance, the truth was finally coming to light. The buried Cadillac had sparked a chain of events that could no longer be stopped. The detectives had uncovered the full scope of the conspiracy, and they were finally in position to bring Vito and his syndicate to justice. But even as they closed in on their target, the question remained: how far would Vito go to protect the empire he had spent decades building? The investigation had revealed just how deep the corruption ran, not only within the criminal world, but in the very fabric of Chicago itself. Law enforcement, politicians, and even businessmen had all been complicit in Vito's rise to power. They had turned a blind eye to his actions, allowing him to control the city's underworld without fear of reprisal. But now the truth was catching up with him. The final push came when the detectives uncovered Vito's last known whereabouts, a meeting with a group of high-ranking members of the syndicate. It was clear that Vito had been preparing for something big, something that would secure his control over Chicago's criminal world once and for all. But in his arrogance, he had underestimated the power of those seeking justice. His carefully constructed empire was beginning to crack, and the walls were closing in. As the authorities closed in on Vito, they found him hiding in plain sight, operating from a nondescript warehouse on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't the grand mansion or the luxurious hideouts that one might expect from a man of his stature. It was a modest location, one that reflected Vito's new, more cautious approach. He knew that the law was closing in, and he had been preparing for his final escape. But Vito's luck had finally run out. In a swift and decisive operation, the authorities raided the warehouse, apprehending Vito and several of his key associates. As they arrested him, Vito didn't show fear, only the cold, calculating look of a man who had been expecting this day to come eventually. He knew it was over, but he had always believed he could escape the consequences of his actions. He had spent decades living in the shadows, controlling a criminal empire from behind the scenes. And for a while, it had seemed as though he was untouchable. But in the end, Vito the Viper Greco was no match for the persistence of justice. His reign over Chicago's underworld had come to an end, and the city would never be the same again. Tony DiMarco's disappearance, once thought to be a mystery that would never be solved, had unraveled a massive conspiracy that brought down one of the most dangerous syndicates in American history. The buried Cadillac, Tony's final legacy, had become the symbol of the truth that had been hidden for so long. It had taken decades, but in the end, the past had been uncovered, and the criminals who had controlled Chicago's streets were finally held accountable. As Vito was led away in handcuffs, the city breathed a sigh of relief. The darkness that had once ruled the streets was finally being driven out. And for those who had fought for justice, the long wait had been worth it. The truth had finally been revealed, and the criminals who thought they were untouchable had been brought to their knees. Tony DiMarco, once a feared mafia boss, had disappeared for good. But in his absence, the city had found its redemption. As Vito the Viper Greco was led away in handcuffs, the weight of his capture was felt throughout Chicago. For decades, the city had lived under the shadow of his criminal empire, a shadow that stretched into every corner of its streets, from the darkest alleys to the polished offices of politicians and businessmen who had turned a blind eye to his reign. Vito had been untouchable, operating with a quiet arrogance that made him believe he could never be caught. But now, after 60 years, justice had caught up with him, and the city would never be the same again. The investigation into Tony DiMarco's disappearance, which had once seemed like a cold case, had now unraveled a dark and complex web of corruption, betrayal, and power. Vito's role in orchestrating Tony's downfall and erasing him from the criminal landscape was just the tip of the iceberg. The authorities had discovered the full extent of his involvement in countless illegal activities, smuggling rings, money laundering, underground gambling operations, and even connections to corrupt law enforcement. It became clear that Vito's ambition knew no bounds. He had played a long game, carefully positioning himself to take over the entire city's underworld, and once he had done so, he had wiped away any trace of his rival, Tony DiMarco, in a ruthless power grab. The buried Cadillac had been the most chilling symbol of all. It wasn't just a car, it was Tony's legacy, a piece of him that Vito had ensured would be buried, forgotten. For years, the Cadillac had been hidden in the depths of a warehouse, preserved in an attempt to erase Tony's existence from the history of Chicago's criminal world. It was as though Vito had wanted to make sure that no one would remember the man who had once ruled the city, and anyone who dared to try and uncover the truth would be silenced as well. But Vito had miscalculated. His arrogance had blinded him to the persistence of those who sought justice. The very thing he had tried to bury, the truth, had come to light, and it had brought his empire crashing down. Rita, Tony's wife, who had long since accepted the pain of her husband's disappearance, was finally able to close the chapter on her painful past. When she was informed of Vito's arrest, the weight of years of uncertainty began to lift from her shoulders. The man who had taken her husband from her, the man who had stolen her future, was finally facing the consequences of his actions. She had always believed Tony was betrayed, but now she knew the extent of the betrayal. Tony's fears about Vito's intentions were not just paranoia, they had been the truth. As the investigation continued, it became apparent that Vito's grip on the city was far deeper than anyone had realized. The syndicate he had built with Tony's empire as its foundation had infiltrated every corner of Chicago's underworld. But now, with Vito behind bars, the remaining members of the syndicate were scattering. Without their leader, they were desperate, turning on one another, each trying to claim whatever power was left. The authorities worked tirelessly to bring down the remaining members of the syndicate, breaking apart the operation piece by piece. It wasn't easy, and the battle would continue for months, but the fall of Vito Greco had sent a clear message to the criminal world. No one was untouchable. The city of Chicago, scarred by decades of corruption and violence, began to heal. The men and women who had been manipulated, coerced, and silenced by the syndicate now had a chance to breathe freely again. Tony DiMarco's disappearance had cast a long, dark shadow over the city, but as the truth came to light, that shadow was finally lifting. The underworld that had once been untouchable was now vulnerable, its power structure crumbling from within. Tony's Cadillac, once buried in the earth to erase his existence, had instead become a symbol of the city's reckoning. It was a reminder that even the darkest secrets, no matter how well hidden, would eventually be uncovered. The buried car had been a marker, not just of a man's fall from power, but of the tenacity of those who fought for the truth, who refused to let the shadows of the past control their future. Tony may have been gone, but his story, and the fight for justice that followed, had sparked a change that no one could undo. In the end, the city had reclaimed its soul, and Vito Greco, the man who had thought he could bend it to his will, had been brought to justice. Chicago had faced its demons, and for the first time in decades, the streets seemed a little brighter, a little freer. As Vito was taken away in the back of a squad car, his once unshakable confidence now shattered, the city stood at the crossroads of a new era. The Mafia's grip on Chicago had loosened, and though the road ahead would still be challenging, the people of the city knew one thing for certain: they would never again let their history be buried beneath the weight of corruption and crime. Tony DiMarco's legacy, though hidden for so long, had ultimately been the key to breaking the chains that bound the city. The past had been uncovered, and with it, the promise of a future where justice could finally prevail.